A retired handyman in Sudbury, Ontario, spent 11 years fixing things for free. Furnaces, leaking pipes, broken locks, cracked drywall. He never sent an invoice, never kept a record. He just showed up with his toolbox and he fixed what was broken. And the only people he ever called were the ones who couldn't afford to call anyone else. Then, one February, he collapsed in a stranger's basement with a hammer in his hand. And on the night they told him he had maybe 6 months left. 53 people he had never expected to see again drove through a snowstorm to find him. His name was Gerald Ashford. He was 57 years old. He drove a 2003 pickup truck with a cracked rear window and a rusted tailgate that only stayed up if you propped it with a length of 2x4. The truck smelled like sawdust and WD-40 and the faint ghost of the cigarettes he'd quit 12 years ago. It was, to most people who saw it idling outside their houses on a winter morning, the most welcome sight they had ever seen. Gerald had lived in Sudbury his whole life, except for 2 years in his early 20s when he'd tried Fort McMurray and come back thinner and quieter, and with enough money saved to take a plumbing course at Northern College. He worked for a contractor through his 30s, good steady work, the kind that leaves your hands wrecked by 40 but lets you know exactly what you're worth. He got married at 32 to a woman named Elaine. They had a daughter together, a girl named Margot, born in 1994 on a Tuesday in March when the snow was still knee-deep on Elm Street. Gerald was in the delivery room, holding Elaine's hand so hard she told him afterward that her fingers had gone numb. They were happy. Not the kind of happy you read about, not the storybook version, but the real kind. The kind built out of Saturday morning pancakes and arguing about whose turn it was to shovel and watching Margot figure out how to skate on the pond behind the duplex they rented on Maley Drive. It was a good life. Small but solid. Elaine died in 2004. Ovarian cancer. She was 41. From diagnosis to the end was 8 months. Most of it spent in the regional hospital on Paris Street, and Gerald spent those months driving back and forth between the hospital and home, trying to keep Margot's world from falling apart while his own was collapsing from the inside. Margot was 10. She understood more than he wanted her to and less than she needed to, and every night Gerald would sit on the edge of her bed after she fell asleep and try to figure out how a man explains to a 10-year-old that the world is allowed to be this cruel. He never fully figured it out. He just kept going. After Elaine, Gerald couldn't go back to the contractor. He tried for 6 months, showing up to job sites and swinging hammers and telling himself it was fine. And then one morning, he walked into a new build in Hanmer and smelled fresh drywall compound, and something cracked open in him that he hadn't known was sealed. He sat in his truck in the driveway for 45 minutes before he could drive home. He took odd jobs instead. Word of mouth. His neighbor's sister needed her bathroom retiled. A man from his old hockey league had a sump pump that had died overnight and a basement full of water. A woman on Barry Down Road had a front door that wouldn't close properly and a landlord who'd stopped returning her calls. Gerald fixed the tile. He fixed the sump pump. He fixed the door. He charged what he could, which was sometimes the going rate, and sometimes whatever the person handed him, and sometimes nothing at all, because he'd learned something about himself in the years after Elaine, that the only time his mind went quiet was when his hands were working. The free work started quietly, the way most things that matter start. Not with a decision, exactly. More like a habit that forms before you've noticed it forming. The first person he didn't charge was a woman named Dorothea Keynes. She was 68 years old, lived alone in a small house on Kathleen Street, and she had called him in January because her furnace had stopped working and the temperature in the house had dropped below 10 degrees overnight. He found the problem in 40 minutes, a cracked heat exchanger, not dangerous, but not something to leave alone. And then he looked at the kitchen while he was writing up the estimate. The counter had a bowl with 2 apples in it. There was no other food visible. The fridge, when he moved past it on his way to the door, was making the particular silence of a fridge with very little in it. He told her the repair would cost what the parts cost. $62. She wrote him a check with hands that shook slightly, and she said thank you in a way that had more in it than just the furnace, and Gerald drove home and sat in his driveway for a long time. After that, he started paying more attention, not looking for charity cases, just seeing what was in front of him. He'd been going into people's homes for 20 years, and he'd gotten good at reading a house the way a doctor reads a patient. The state of the caulking around a bathtub, whether the windows had plastic sheeting on them in winter, the particular quality of silence in a home where someone is managing very carefully and very alone. He kept a notebook in his truck. Not for invoices, for addresses. He'd write down a street, a name, a small note about what he'd seen. Furnace needs annual servicing. Woman in her 70s, no car. Roof patch needed, family with 4 kids, father between jobs. Water heater likely failing within a year, single mother, working nights. He went back to those houses before they called him. He never told anyone he was doing it. He told Margot he was keeping busy. He told his neighbor Lorne he had more work than he knew what to do with. He told the truth in the way that people tell the truth when they've decided that what they're actually doing is nobody's business. Over the years, the notebook filled up. Then a second one. Then a third. He kept them in a box under the passenger seat of the truck, and sometimes on long drives, he'd reach under the seat and feel the stack of them there. The way you'd touch something that's become a talisman without your meaning it to. 11 years. Somewhere north of 400 separate jobs. Furnaces and water heaters, and burst pipes, and leaking roofs, and cracked foundations, and electrical panels that should have been replaced in 1987 and weren't. Locks that a woman had called him about after she'd left a bad situation and needed to feel safe in her own house before she could sleep. A ramp he built over a winter weekend for a man in a wheelchair whose family had tried to get the city to do it for 6 months and been shuffled through 3 departments and a waiting list. Gerald built the ramp on a Saturday and a Sunday. He didn't tell the family how much lumber cost. He was not a saint. He wanted to be clear about that if anyone had asked him, which nobody did. He lost his temper in traffic. He could be stubborn to the point of stupidity about things that didn't matter, like which route to take across town, or whether a certain kind of screw was actually better than another kind. He was not great at saying how he felt out loud, and Margot had told him at least twice in her adult life that he was the most emotionally illegible person she had ever known. Said with love, but said firmly, the way she'd inherited from her mother the ability to be honest in a way that landed without cruelty. He had nobody telling him to stop. That was the problem. Elaine would have told him to stop, not the work. She'd have understood the work. But the way he was doing it, the way he was pouring everything out and putting nothing back. She had understood that about him. The way he could give until there was nothing left and call it living. Elaine wasn't there. And Gerald was 64 years old in the body of a man 10 years older than that, with knees that had given out twice in the past year, and a lower back that woke him up at 4 in the morning on bad nights, and a persistent shortness of breath that he'd been attributing to the cold for 18 months and not thinking too hard about. He collapsed in February. Not dramatically, he just went down. He'd been in the basement of a house on Regent Street, helping a young couple with a hot water tank that had finally given out. He'd replaced the tank, bled the lines, tested the connections, stood up from where he'd been kneeling, and then the room tilted on its axis in a way rooms are not supposed to tilt, and he sat down on the cold concrete floor and didn't get up. The couple called 911. Gerald argued with the paramedics until they pointed out that he was gray and that his lips had a bluish tinge that wasn't typical for a man who felt fine. He stopped arguing and let them put him in the ambulance. The diagnosis came back in pieces, the way bad news tends to. Congestive heart failure. His heart had been compensating for years for what appeared to be significant blockage in 2 of the main arteries. He needed surgery. A double bypass, the kind of procedure that was not optional and was not minor and carried a recovery time measured in months, not weeks. Without it, the cardiologist told him plainly, he was looking at a major cardiac event within the year. Possibly sooner. Do you have someone to contact? Gerald thought about the question for longer than he should have. Margot. He had Margot. He called her from the hospital room. She was in Ottawa. She'd moved there 8 years ago after finishing nursing school. Met a man named Declan who worked for the federal government and was the kind of steady, grounded person that Gerald had approved of immediately and deeply, because Declan reminded him of nobody so much as himself. She had 2 kids now, a boy named Sam and a girl named Fiona, age 6 and 4. Margot picked up on the second ring. Dad, what's wrong? Not a question. His daughter had always been able to tell. He told her. He heard the sound she made on the other end of the line. The particular silence of a person absorbing something while also absolutely refusing to fall apart on the phone. And he recognized it because he had made the same sound when they told him about Elaine. He recognized it because Margot had learned it from him. She was in Sudbury by the next morning. She had left Declan with the kids and driven 7 hours through the night, and she walked into his hospital room. At 6 in the morning, with a Tim's coffee in each hand and red eyes, she hadn't bothered to try to hide. And Gerald took one look at her and started crying, which he hadn't done in front of another person in more years than he could count. He told her about the surgery. He told her about the recovery. He did not tell her about the notebook under the seat of his truck, or the 400 jobs, or the 300 and some odd houses, where he had fixed something and charged nothing, or the fact that most of the money he should have saved over the past 11 years had gone back out in parts and supplies and gas and the occasional grocery run that he'd left on a doorstep without a name attached. He was planning to not tell her at all, but Margot found the notebooks. She'd gone to the truck to get his winter coat out of the back seat, and she'd bumped the passenger seat moving something. And the box had shifted, and she'd pulled it out without really meaning to, and opened the first notebook and stood in the hospital parking lot at -22, reading 11 years of her father's handwriting in the gray February morning. She came back to his room and set the box on the table beside his bed and looked at him. He looked at the box, then at her. She said, "How long?" 11 years, he said. She sat down in the chair beside his bed and was quiet for a full minute. Not angry, not scolding. Just sitting with it, the way she'd learned to sit with things. Then she said, "Does anyone know?" He shook his head. She nodded. She picked up the first notebook and started reading from the beginning. Gerald's surgery was scheduled for a Thursday in March. The waiting period was 6 weeks of restricted activity, daily medication, a list of things he was not supposed to do that included almost everything he did every day. No lifting over 5 pounds. No climbing. No cold exposure. Rest. Gerald was very bad at rest. Margot stayed for 2 weeks. She managed his medications and bullied him into eating properly, and drove him to his cardiology follow-ups, and at night, after he was asleep, she sat at the kitchen table and read the notebooks. All of them. Every address, every name, every small notation. Furnace, pipes, roof patch, lock changed, called at 11 p.m., woman's voice shaking. Ramp built, 2 days, lumber from Home Hardware on La Salle. Water heater, elderly man, lives alone, check in spring. On the second to last night before she had to go back to Ottawa, Margot posted something in a local Facebook group. The Sudbury one, the big one, where people post about garage sales and lost dogs and city council complaints. She kept it short. Does anyone know Gerald Ashford? He's a handyman who's been doing free repairs for people in Sudbury for the last 11 years. He's in the hospital right now and he needs help. If he ever came to your house and wouldn't take your money, please reach out. She posted it at 10:47 at night. By 11 o'clock there were 6 replies. By midnight there were 40. She fixed the door in my garage after my husband left, and I didn't tell her what was in my wallet. She already knew. He replaced my hot water heater in November 3 years ago. I had $30 to my name. He told me to save it for groceries. He built a ramp for my father. He came on a Saturday. He brought his own lunch and he wouldn't let us feed him. He was done by Sunday evening. We tried to pay him and he said the ramp didn't need payment, it just needed building. My furnace went out during that bad cold snap in 2019. My kids were sleeping in their coats. He was there by 8 in the morning. He fixed it in 2 hours and he didn't send a bill. He left a bag of groceries on the porch. I never figured out how he knew we needed them. The messages kept coming. Women who had been alone and scared in houses that were falling apart. Men who had been between jobs and too proud to ask for help, and had found Gerald there before they had to ask. Seniors who had been managing on pension, amounts that don't stretch through a Sudbury winter when something breaks. Families on the margins who had been one failed furnace away from a crisis, and had been rescued, quietly and without ceremony, by a man in a cracked windshield pickup truck who wrote their addresses in a notebook and came back before they called. One message came in at 2 a.m. My name is Warren Ossie. I'm a contractor. I was 23 years old and completely broke when Gerald came and fixed the pipes in the basement apartment I was renting on Lorne Street. I told him I'd pay him as soon as I had work. He told me I didn't owe him anything, but if I ever had the chance to do something for someone who needed it, I should do it. I've been doing it ever since. I've been doing it because of him. I'm in. Margot stared at the screen for a long time. Then she started making calls. She worked the phone from the kitchen table after Gerald went to sleep. She called the numbers people left in the comments. She texted, she messaged, she connected with people through 3 degrees of small city separation and the particular efficiency of a community that is actually, despite everything, still a community. She was a nurse. She had the unsentimental practicality of a person who has spent her professional life doing triage, and she applied that to this problem the same way she applied it to everything. What does he need? What can we get him? The surgery cost was covered through OHIP, thank God. That wasn't the problem. The problem was the 6 months of recovery that the cardiologist had described. The follow-up appointments. The cardiac rehab program. The medication costs that weren't fully covered. The fact that Gerald had no savings, because Gerald had spent his savings on other people's water heaters for 11 years. By the time the Facebook thread had run for 48 hours, a GoFundMe page that Margot had set up at midnight had raised $64,000. Gerald didn't know about any of it. He was home by then, under strict instructions to do nothing more strenuous than walking to the kitchen. And he'd been managing this by sitting in his armchair and driving himself slowly crazy. He'd reorganized his toolbox twice. He'd read 3 library books Margot had brought him and retained approximately none of them. He'd watched more television in 2 weeks than he had in the previous 3 years. He did not know that 53 people had confirmed they were coming. He did not know that Warren Ossie had reached out to 22 other tradespeople in the region. All of them in their 30s and 40s. All of them who had gotten their start through Gerald's quiet network of word of mouth and favors done without accounting. And that Warren had proposed something. We're going to fix his house. He did not know that Margot had found the stack of deferred maintenance on his own home, the eave screws that needed replacing, the back door that was drafty, the bathroom exhaust fan that hadn't worked in 4 years, the cracked section of foundation that Gerald had written in his notebook under a heading that said, "Do this when you have time," and had passed that list to Warren. On a Thursday evening in March, 3 days before Gerald's surgery, Margot told him she needed him to sit in the living room. He sat. He was suspicious. The knock came at 7 o'clock. Not a tentative knock. A knock from someone who knows you're in there and isn't planning to wait. He opened the door. Margot was behind him, not saying anything. A man's stood on the porch. Black jacket, work boots, late 30s, the kind of face that has spent a lot of time in weather. He was holding a casserole dish. Gerald looked at him. "My name is Warren Ossie. You probably don't remember me. You fixed my pipes on Lorne Street in 2013. I was 23. I told you I'd pay you back someday." Gerald blinked. He remembered the apartment. He didn't remember the face. Behind Warren, the porch steps were full. People were standing down the front walk and onto the sidewalk and into the street. Some of them had dishes. Some of them had envelopes. Some of them had children bundled in snowsuits, kids who had no idea where they were or why, only that their parents had driven out on a cold Thursday night and were standing in the snow in front of a stranger's house as though it were the most important place in the world. and to every single person on that sidewalk, it was. A woman stepped forward. She was maybe 60. She had her coat buttoned wrong, 2 buttons off, the way a person buttons a coat when they're distracted because they've been crying. You came to my house in January of 2018. My furnace was out. My husband had left the year before, and I didn't know anything about furnaces. I didn't know anything about any of it. You were there by 9 in the morning. You fixed it, and you sat in my kitchen and had a cup of tea, and you talked to me about nothing, about the weather, about which roads had been plowed, and you didn't ask me a single thing about how I was really doing or what was really going on. And I want you to know that that cup of tea, that completely ordinary cup of tea about nothing, was the thing that got me through January. Just knowing that someone could sit in my kitchen and treat me like a regular person. She stopped, steadied herself. Her name was Ellen Marcotte, and she had driven 40 minutes from Chelmsford, and she had brought a lasagna, and she was not finished. I have a daughter now who just bought her first house in New Sudbury, and the first thing I taught her when she moved in was how to check the furnace filter, because you told me that in my kitchen that day. And I told her why I knew it. She knows your name. Gerald stood in the doorway with his hand on the frame because his legs had decided this was not the moment to be reliable. A man in the back raised his hand. He was tall, wearing a Carhartt jacket, probably mid-40s. You built a ramp for my dad. He died last year, but he spent the last 3 years of his life getting in and out of his own house without help because of what you built on a weekend with your own lumber. My dad was a proud man. He would have hated a wheelchair ramp if it had come from charity, but it didn't feel like charity when you built it. It felt like a neighbor doing a thing that needed doing. He stopped, cleared his throat. I told my kids that story at his funeral. My son is 8. He told his class about it for show and tell. His teacher called me afterward. She said he told the class that his grandfather had a friend who fixed things and that fixing things was a kind of love. Gerald made a sound that was not a word. The voices came one after another, not organized, not rehearsed. Just people saying true things in the order that the true things arrive. A woman who'd had her locks changed on the night she'd finally left. A family whose burst pipe in -30 had been stopped by Gerald showing up at 6 in the morning. A senior couple who had been managing a slow leak for 3 months because they didn't want to bother anyone, and Gerald had found out somehow and shown up on a Thursday with a new length of pipe and refused lunch 3 times before finally accepting a piece of pie. They had remembered every detail, every cup of tea accepted or refused, every joke Gerald had made while lying on his back under a sink, the exact words he'd said when people tried to pay him. Don't worry about it. I was coming this way anyway. You don't owe me a thing. You just call me if it happens again. Pay it forward some other day. Right now, just stay warm. Gerald had a system. He had rules, the same rules he'd followed for 11 years. Don't make it into a thing. Don't let people feel reduced by needing help. Get in, fix it, get out. Don't stay long enough for them to get uncomfortable about the money. Leave before the gratitude gets heavy. He had spent 11 years making sure people didn't have to feel the weight of receiving. And now he was standing in his doorway with 53 people on his front walk, and every single piece of that weight was landing on him, and there was nowhere to put it, no job to redirect it into, no task to keep his hands busy while his chest processed something. It hadn't had to process before. Warren stepped up and took his arm, not asking. Margot appeared on his other side. Gerald let them. They walked him to his armchair. Someone put a quilt on him, his mother's quilt. He hadn't known anyone knew where it was. People came in small groups, 3 and 4 at a time, moving through the house in a rotation that Margot had organized without telling him. Warren's wife set out food on the kitchen table. Someone made tea. Children ran around in the way children run when adults are doing something emotional and nobody is watching them carefully. Margot sat on the arm of his chair and didn't say anything, just stayed there. Warren came and crouched in front of the armchair and pulled out his phone. Gerald, there's something I need to show you. The GoFundMe page, the number at the top. $64,218 as of an hour ago. Gerald looked at it. He read it twice. He said, "What is that?" "That's people. That's the community." Gerald shook his head. "I didn't do any of it for money. Nobody thinks you did." "That's exactly why they gave it." Gerald stared at the number. It didn't make sense in the way that some things don't make sense, not because they're false, but because they're too true for the brain to sort quickly. "That's too much," he said. Warren said, "Your surgery is Thursday. Your cardiac rehab is 4 months. You're going to need 6 months off before you can work. You have no savings because you spent your savings fixing other people's problems for 11 years. So no, it's not too much, it's what's owed." Gerald started to say something. Warren kept going. "And there's one more thing. We're coming on Saturday. All the contractors. There's about 22 of us. We're going to fix your house." Gerald opened his mouth. Warren held up a hand. "The eavestrow, the back door, the bathroom fan, the foundation crack on the north side. We have the list." Gerald looked at Margot. Margot looked at the ceiling. "You told me you were going to do it when you had time," she said. "You've had 11 years. Gerald laughed. The kind of laugh that shakes through a person because there's no other way for that particular feeling to get out. And then he stopped laughing and pressed his hand over his eyes and breathed through the thing that had been sitting in his chest for 11 years without a name. The weight of giving without ever figuring out how to receive. The weight of keeping a box of notebooks under the seat of a truck instead of letting anyone in close enough to see them. He pressed his hand over his eyes and breathed. When he moved his hand, Warren was still there. Margot was still there. 53 people were in and around his house, eating food on his kitchen table and letting his mother's quilt be used and not making a production out of any of it, just being there the way Gerald had been there for them. Quietly. Without ceremony. Showing up because something needed doing, and they were the ones who could do it. The surgery was on a Thursday. Gerald came out of it fine. He was in recovery when Margot arrived, and the second thing he said after the anesthesia fog started to clear was, "Who's looking after the truck?" Margot told him the truck was fine. He said, "The notebooks are under the seat," she said. "I know, I have them." He said, "Don't throw them out." She said, "Dad, I know." He recovered at home, slowly, stubbornly, the way Gerald did everything. Margot came up from Ottawa on weekends. Declan brought the kids. Sam was 6. And completely certain that Grandpa had had his heart fixed, the way you fix a broken thing, and he'd told Gerald this with great seriousness, and Gerald had agreed that yes, that was about right. Fiona, who was 4, had brought him a drawing of what she said was a house, and which Gerald kept on the refrigerator. Warren stopped by every second week with food from his wife and updates on a project Gerald hadn't officially agreed to, but which was happening regardless. A few of the tradespeople had started something. A kind of informal network. People who showed up for people who needed showing up for, in the way that Gerald had been showing up, but organized now, with a list and a rotation and a group chat that apparently had 40 people in it. They'd asked Gerald if they could call it something. He'd said he didn't care. They called it Ashford, just that. Ashford. No explanation, no tagline. In Sudbury, anyone who needed to know would figure it out. 6 months after the surgery, Gerald Ashford stood in front of his house on a June morning. The eavesdrows were new. The back door shut, clean and tight. The foundation crack on the north side had been filled and sealed by a man who had been 19 and unemployed in 2015, when Gerald had fixed his mother's water heater and told him to look into trade school. It was good, steady work. The man had gone to Cambrian College the following September. He was 30 now. He had his own company. He'd done the foundation work at cost, which meant Gerald paid for materials and nothing else. Gerald touched the new eavesdrow. Then he walked around the side of the house and opened the back door and listened to the sound it made, which was the sound of a door that is hung correctly and seals properly and does what it's supposed to do. He stood in the kitchen. The toolbox was on the table. He'd left it there on purpose. He picked up the phone and called Warren. "I'm thinking about going back on Tuesday." Warren said. "Already?" Gerald said. "There's a woman on Kathleen Street. I was in there in January for a furnace, and when I left I noticed the bathroom floor had some give in it. It's been bothering me." Silence. Then Warren said, "I'll come with you." Gerald didn't say anything for a moment. His hands knew how to do this. 11 years of hands that knew how to fix things without asking. He wasn't sure he knew how to let another set of hands in alongside his. But he thought about 53 people standing in the snow on his front walk. He thought about his daughter reading notebooks in a hospital parking lot at -22. He thought about Warren saying, "I've been doing it because of him," and meaning it. He said, "All right, 8 o'clock." He hung up. He picked up his jacket from the back of the chair, the jacket that was warm and dry and in good repair because Margot had sewn the pocket lining in March while he was sleeping. He put it on. He picked up the toolbox. Heavier than it should be, but his heart, the cardiologist had told him, was actually stronger now than it had been in years. That was how it worked, sometimes. You took the broken thing apart and fixed what was actually wrong, and when it came back together, it worked better than it had in longer than you could remember. He went out to the truck. The windshield was new. The tailgate stayed up on its own. He drove north on Paris Street in the early morning, Sudbury coming awake around him, Tim Hortons and construction sites and the particular wide gray sky of northern Ontario in June. He reached under the seat by habit. The box wasn't there. He'd put a new notebook in the glove box instead. He took it out at a red light, opened it to the first page. "Kathleen Street," he wrote. "Bathroom floor. Go Tuesday." Then he set the notebook on the dash and drove. Some things don't change. Some things shouldn't. And sometimes the most stubborn man in a cracked windshield truck, the one who can't figure out how to be helped, has to have his whole heart taken apart before he learns that fixing things was never meant to be something he did alone.